At 9:04 on the morning of December 6, 1917, the city of Halifax simply ceased to exist. A blast equivalent to nearly 3 kilotons of TNT, the largest man-made explosion the world had ever seen, leveled 2.5 square kilometers of the city's north end in an instant. Nearly 2,000 people were killed, 9,000 more were injured. Entire neighborhoods were erased so completely that rescue workers couldn't tell where the streets had been. The official story came quickly: a tragic accident. The French munitions ship Mont-Blanc, loaded with high explosives, had collided with the Norwegian vessel Imo in the narrow strait of Halifax Harbour. A fire broke out. The crew abandoned ship. 20 minutes later, the blast tore the world apart. It was a disaster. It was a wartime tragedy. And for decades, that was all it was allowed to be. But what no one was permitted to say, what the British Admiralty worked methodically to suppress, was that the explosion was not simply an accident. It was a consequence. Warnings had been issued, protocols had been ignored, and overloaded munitions ships had been funneled through one of the most congested harbours in the British Empire, again and again, because the wartime chain of command deemed the risk acceptable. Halifax Harbour in 1917 was among the busiest waterways in the North Atlantic. It served as the primary assembly point for wartime convoys crossing to Europe, funneling an enormous volume of military and commercial traffic through a passage called the Narrows, a channel barely 400 meters wide at its tightest point. The Mont-Blanc arrived on December 5th, loaded in New York with a staggering cargo: 2,300 tons of wet and dry picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 35 tons of benzol in deck-mounted drums, and 10 tons of gun cotton. She was, by any reasonable measure, a floating bomb. Her captain, Aim Le Mdec, had requested permission to fly the red munitions flag, warning other vessels to keep their distance. He was told not to. The concern was that advertising the cargo would make her a target for German U-boats, so the most dangerous ship in the harbour entered the Narrows unmarked, unescorted, and carrying enough explosive power to flatten a city. This was not the first time. British naval authorities had been routing munitions vessels through Halifax with increasing frequency throughout 1917. Harbour pilots had raised concerns. Local officials had warned that the volume of explosive cargo passing through the Narrows was a disaster waiting to happen. Those warnings went up the chain of command. They did not come back down. On the morning of December 6th, the Mont-Blanc entered the Narrows heading inbound. The Imo, a Belgian relief ship under Norwegian charter, was heading outbound. What followed was a chain of navigation errors, miscommunications, and violations of right-of-way rules that brought the two vessels onto a converging path. The Imo had been delayed the previous evening, and her pilot was pushing to make up time. She was traveling faster than harbour regulations allowed and had already made irregular course changes to avoid other traffic. The Mont-Blanc, weighed down by her cargo and unable to maneuver quickly, attempted to pass starboard to starboard, the wrong side for harbour traffic. Whistle signals were exchanged. Neither vessel yielded. At approximately 8:45 a.m., the Imo's bow struck the Mont-Blanc on her starboard side, rupturing the hull near the benzol drums lashed to the forward deck. Sparks from the collision ignited the benzol. Fire spread rapidly across the deck. Captain Le Mdec, knowing what his ship carried, ordered the crew to abandon her. They rowed for the Dartmouth shore. The Mont-Blanc, now burning fiercely, drifted toward Pier 6 in the Richmond district. People gathered along the waterfront to watch. No one had told them what she was carrying. 19 minutes later, at 9:04:35 a.m., the Mont-Blanc detonated. The blast obliterated the Richmond district entirely. Every structure within a half-mile radius was destroyed. The pressure wave shattered windows 20 miles away. A 30-foot tsunami swept through the harbour, washing the wreckage of boats and buildings into a churning mass. The barrel of one of the Mont-Blanc's cannons was found 3.5 miles from the explosion site. Her anchor shank, weighing over half a ton, landed 2 miles in the opposite direction. The human toll was staggering. Of the nearly 2,000 dead, many were never identified. Roughly 600 of them were children. An entire school in the Richmond district, the Protestant orphanage on Vaith Street, was destroyed with all its occupants inside. 9,000 people were wounded, and over 300 of those injuries were eye lacerations caused by flying glass, because hundreds of residents had been standing at their windows watching the fire on the harbour when the blast wave arrived. The following night, a blizzard buried the ruined city under 16 inches of snow. Rescue operations slowed to a crawl. Fires burned in the wreckage for days. Survivors wandered through streets they could no longer recognize, searching for families they would never find. But what would prove equally devastating, though far more quietly, was the campaign to control who would be held responsible. Within days of the explosion, Canadian authorities launched an inquiry under Rec Commissioner Arthur Drysdale. The hearings began on December 13th, just 1 week after the blast, while bodies were still being pulled from the rubble. From the outset, the inquiry's scope was aggressively narrow. Drysdale focused almost exclusively on the actions of the two ships' crews. Pilot Francis Mackey, who had guided the Mont-Blanc into the harbour, became the primary target. Captain Le Mdec was arrested. The inquiry's conclusion, delivered in February 1918, placed blame squarely on the Mont-Blanc, on Mackey for his navigation, on Le Mdec for not doing more to warn the city, and on the ship herself for carrying such a dangerous cargo. What the inquiry did not examine, what it was apparently instructed not to examine, was how that cargo came to be in the harbour in the first place. Who had authorized the routing? Who had overruled the safety concerns? Who had ordered Le Mdec not to fly the red flag? Those questions pointed upward, toward the British Admiralty and the Royal Canadian Navy's chain of command, and those questions were not asked. The British Admiralty had direct authority over convoy operations in Halifax. Rear Admiral Bertram Chambers, the chief examining officer, controlled which ships entered the harbour and when. Commander Frederick Wyatt, the port's chief examining officer under Chambers, was responsible for harbour traffic management. Both men had received warnings about the dangers of routing heavy munitions ships through the Narrows without adequate safety protocols. Testimony that emerged later, much of it suppressed during the Drysdale inquiry, revealed that harbour officials had raised alarms repeatedly throughout 1917. Pilots had complained that munitions ships were entering the Narrows at the same time as outbound traffic, creating exactly the conditions that led to the collision. These complaints were documented. They were filed. They were ignored. Commander Wyatt was initially charged alongside Mackey and Le Mdec, but was quietly released without trial. The Admiralty closed ranks. Internal communications regarding harbour safety protocols were classified. Canadian officials who pushed for a broader inquiry, one that would examine the systemic failures of wartime command, found their efforts blocked at every turn. The message was unmistakable. Blame the pilots, blame the captains, but do not blame the system that put them there. The suppression was methodical. Canadian newspaper editors were pressured to frame the explosion as an unavoidable wartime tragedy. References to Admiralty negligence were discouraged through wartime censorship regulations that were still in full effect. The chief press censor for Canada, Ernest Chambers, had broad authority to suppress reporting deemed harmful to the war effort, and criticism of British Naval Command decisions fell squarely within that mandate. Pilot Francis Mackey, who had been made the public face of blame, was eventually exonerated by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1919, after an appeal overturned the Drysdale findings. The court found that both vessels bore responsibility for the collision and, critically, that the inquiry had failed to consider the broader circumstances that created the conditions for the disaster. But by then, the narrative had already calcified. The explosion was an accident. The pilots were careless. The war demanded sacrifices. For decades, the full picture remained buried in classified naval records and forgotten filing cabinets. It was not until historians began systematically examining Admiralty correspondence in the latter half of the 20th century that the pattern of ignored warnings, suppressed testimony, and institutional self-protection became undeniably clear. The Halifax explosion was not merely a collision between two ships. It was the predictable result of a command structure that prioritized operational speed over human life and then silenced anyone who said so. Today, a memorial bell tower stands on Fort Needham, overlooking the spot where the Richmond district once stood. Every December 6th, a ceremony marks the anniversary. The city of Halifax sends a Christmas tree to Boston each year. a tradition of gratitude that began in 1918 when the Massachusetts Public Safety Committee dispatched emergency relief trains within hours of the explosion. That gesture of thanks has continued for more than a century, but gratitude and remembrance are not the same as accountability. The British Admiralty never acknowledged its role. No senior naval officer was disciplined for the routing decisions that placed a floating arsenal in the most congested channel of Halifax Harbour. The families of the dead were left to grieve a tragedy that official history told them was simply bad luck. The Halifax explosion remains the deadliest disaster in Canadian history. It was also one of the earliest and most complete examples of institutional memory suppression, a template that would be repeated throughout the 20th century whenever the cost of war fell not on the commanders who waged it, but on the civilians who happened to live nearby. The blast itself lasted less than a second. The silence that followed lasted generations.